Edward II entered history as one of the most hated kings of England, a ruler who openly preferred men, elevated a male favorite above the nobility, and allowed him to wield power so brazenly that the entire kingdom seethed with anger. His own wife, a French princess, later joined her lover in an invading force to remove him from the throne, and the king's end became one of the most disturbing episodes in medieval Europe. Chroniclers wrote that he was killed with a red-hot iron rod inserted into his anus, a method meant to leave no external marks and reduce his death to a grim legend about how the reign of a man consumed by his own desires finally collapsed. Edward became King of England in 1307, and from the very first day of his reign it was obvious to everyone watching that something was deeply wrong with how he understood power and what it meant to be a monarch. He was 23 years old when his father died and left him the throne, which meant he was old enough to know better, old enough to understand the political realities of medieval kingship, but instead of taking the crown seriously he used it as a tool to elevate the one person who mattered to him more than anything else in the world. That person was Piers Gaveston, a French knight who had been Edward's close companion since they were teenagers, and the relationship between them was something that went far beyond normal medieval friendship between men. The way Edward looked at Gaveston, the way he touched him in public, the way he gave him gifts and titles and treated him as though he were more important than anyone else in England, including the most powerful nobles and even Edward's own wife. All of this made it clear that the new king was in love with this man in a way that violated every rule of acceptable behavior in Christian medieval society. Now, medieval kings having male favorites was not completely unheard of, but there were unwritten rules about how these relationships were supposed to work, and Edward broke every single one of them. You were supposed to be discreet. You were supposed to maintain at least the appearance that your political decisions were based on what was good for the kingdom rather than what pleased your lover, and you absolutely were not supposed to let your favorite humiliate and antagonize the nobles whose support you needed to actually govern. In medieval England, a king's authority depended not on absolute power but on cooperation with the major barons, the church, and the political community that would later evolve into parliament, and everyone knew that alienating those groups was dangerous even for a strong ruler. Edward ignored that entirely. He made Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall almost immediately after becoming king, which was a slap in the face to every English noble because that title was traditionally reserved for members of the royal family, and giving it to a foreign knight was basically Edward announcing that this man was more important to him than blood relatives or political alliances. The wealth that came with being Earl of Cornwall was enormous, and suddenly Gaveston was one of the richest men in England, living in luxury and wielding influence that no foreign-born knight should have been able to achieve, and all of it was because the king was besotted with him to the point of losing all political judgment. The English nobles were furious, not just because they were being passed over for honors and positions in favor of this arrogant Frenchman, but because the reason for it was so obvious and so offensive to their Christian morality that it felt like Edward was deliberately insulting them. And in a period where England was still recovering from military failures in Scotland and needed coordinated leadership, seeing the king spend his energy on indulging one man made the situation look even more reckless and dangerous. Gaveston himself made everything worse by being openly contemptuous of the English aristocracy, giving the most powerful lords in the kingdom mocking nicknames and treating them like they were beneath him, apparently confident that Edward's love would protect him from any consequences no matter how many enemies he made. And it did protect him, for a while, because Edward refused to listen to any criticism of Gaveston no matter how reasonable it was or how many nobles were complaining, and he would defend his favorite against anyone who suggested that maybe giving this much power to one man who was neither English nor qualified was a bad idea for England's stability. To the political class watching all this unfold, it became clear very quickly that Edward was not simply misguided, he was a king willing to risk the entire structure of his reign rather than limit the influence of the man he adored. While Edward was busy showering attention and gifts on Gaveston, his actual wife Isabella was learning what it felt like to be completely irrelevant to the man she had been forced to marry. She was only 12 years old when she arrived in England to become Edward's queen, a political arrangement meant to strengthen ties between England and France, and she had probably imagined that her life would involve the usual things that royal marriages involved: respect, partnership in ruling, maybe even affection developing over time. Instead, what she got was a husband who could barely be bothered to acknowledge her existence except when he needed to perform his marital duty and try to produce an heir, and even then it was clear his mind was somewhere else, probably thinking about Gaveston while he was in bed with his wife. Isabella was smart enough to understand what was happening. Even at her young age she could see that her husband was in love with someone else and that someone was not a woman, and she had to sit there at court watching Edward touch Gaveston's arm during meetings, seeing them exchange looks that should have been reserved for spouses, hearing the whispered comments from courtiers about the king's unnatural attachment to his favorite. What made this even worse was that the entire English court understood that insulting a queen was not just a personal slight but a political danger. Queens were expected to embody alliances, legitimacy, continuity, and the respect shown to the monarchy itself. When the king humiliated her, he humiliated the Anglo-French alliance that her marriage had been designed to secure. The humiliation was constant and public, and there was nothing she could do about it because she was just a teenage girl in a foreign country with no power base of her own, completely dependent on a husband who had made it clear she ranked somewhere below his male lover in terms of his priorities. She did her duty and gave Edward children, managing to produce several sons and daughters over the years, but each pregnancy just emphasized how transactional their relationship was because Edward would show up, do what was required to potentially create an heir, and then go back to spending all his time with Gaveston while Isabella raised the children essentially alone. The English nobles watched this situation developing and they understood that the queen was being disrespected in ways that went beyond just personal insult, because a weak and sidelined queen meant the royal marriage was not functioning as the political alliance it was supposed to be, and that meant England's relationship with France was being damaged by Edward's inability to treat his wife with even basic respect. Medieval politics depended heavily on appearances and symbolism. When a king publicly neglected his queen, foreign courts interpreted it as instability, vulnerability, and a breakdown of royal authority. But Isabella was learning and watching and storing up every slight and every humiliation, building a cold rage that would eventually find its outlet in revenge that would destroy Edward completely. And unlike Edward, she paid attention to how power actually worked, which nobles were alienated, which factions were rising, which clerics whispered that the king was losing God's favor. She was slowly mapping out the political landscape that her husband ignored. For now though, she played the role of dutiful wife, appearing at ceremonies and raising the children and maintaining the fiction that everything was normal, while inside she was counting the ways her husband had failed her and waiting for the moment when she would have enough power to make him pay for every single one of them. The situation with Gaveston reached a breaking point in 1311, just 4 years into Edward's reign, when the English nobles decided they had tolerated enough and forced the king to send his favorite into exile. This was not a small group of complainers, this was basically the entire English aristocracy united in opposition to Gaveston's influence, and they made it clear to Edward that he could either send his lover away or face civil war. Their anger had been building for years, fueled not only by Gaveston's arrogance but by the sense that the king was dismantling the traditional balance of power that kept the realm stable. In medieval England, a king could not simply rule by decree. He needed the cooperation of barons, sheriffs, bishops, and knights who supplied money and troops. Gaveston's dominance threatened that entire system. Edward had no choice but to agree because he did not have an army that could fight the combined forces of his nobles, so Gaveston was sent to Ireland, supposedly permanently banished from England. The separation lasted less than a year before Edward brought him back in direct defiance of the nobles' demands, which shows you exactly how much the king valued his political position versus how much he valued being with the man he loved. He chose the man, and in doing so he basically announced that he would rather risk his throne than live without Gaveston, and the nobles understood that they were dealing with a king who could not be reasoned with or controlled through normal political pressure. In 1312 they captured Gaveston while Edward was away from court, and instead of giving the king another chance to bring his favorite back, they executed him immediately, beheading him and ending the problem permanently. The speed and decisiveness of the execution reflected how desperate the nobility had become. They believed that as long as Gaveston lived, England would remain in political paralysis, and they took matters into their own hands because they no longer trusted the king to act in the kingdom's interest. Edward's reaction to Gaveston's death was grief so extreme that it bordered on complete breakdown. Witnesses reported that the king could not function for weeks, that he wept openly and refused to conduct any government business, mourning his lover with an intensity that he had never shown toward anything or anyone else, including his own wife and children. Isabella watched her husband fall apart over the loss of another man, and the message was clear and devastating. She would never matter to Edward the way Gaveston had mattered. Even in death the favorite commanded more of the king's emotional energy than his living wife ever would. But Edward did not learn from this disaster, did not realize that his obsessive attachment to favorites was destroying his ability to rule. Instead he just found new favorites to replace Gaveston. The Despenser family, both father and son named Hugh, became Edward's new obsession, and he repeated the same pattern of giving them lands and power and authority that should have been distributed among the nobility, once again making enemies of the people he needed as allies and once again putting his personal attachments ahead of political stability. And this time the consequences were even worse. The Despensers were far more ruthless and ambitious than Gaveston, and by empowering them Edward not only alienated the nobility but helped create a climate of fear and resentment that would eventually make rebellion against him seem not only justified but necessary. By the early 1320s, Isabella had spent nearly 20 years being humiliated and sidelined by a husband who cared more about his male favorites than about his wife or his kingdom, and she had transformed from that powerless 12-year-old bride into a woman who understood power and how to use it. She was in her 30s now, mother to several of Edward's children including the heir to the throne, and she had been watching and learning and building connections while Edward ignored her in favor of the Despensers. Over the years she had quietly built a network among exiled nobles, dissatisfied clergy, and foreign diplomats who saw in her a far more stable political figure than the king himself. The opportunity she had been waiting for came in 1325 when Edward sent her to France to negotiate with her brother the French king about territorial disputes, and once she was out of England and away from her husband's control, Isabella did something that shocked everyone. She refused to come back. She announced that she was staying in France and that she was done pretending to be a dutiful wife to a man who had spent 2 decades treating her like she was worthless, and she began openly gathering support for an invasion that would remove Edward from power. Her refusal to return was not just personal rebellion, it was a strategic move that took advantage of a long-simmering political crisis. With the Despensers hated across England and the king's authority collapsing after years of defeats and misrule, Isabella suddenly became the rallying point for all factions that wanted Edward gone. Her most important ally was Roger Mortimer, an English noble who had fought against Edward and the Despensers, been imprisoned, escaped, and fled to France where he met Isabella and became her lover. The relationship between Isabella and Mortimer was just as scandalous as Edward's relationships with his male favorites had been, because here was a married queen taking a lover while still technically wed to the king, but the crucial difference was that Isabella's affair was part of a larger political strategy rather than just personal indulgence that ignored the needs of the kingdom. Mortimer offered military experience, noble legitimacy, and a network of allies inside England, exactly the resources Isabella needed. She and Mortimer gathered an invasion force with French support, and they very carefully positioned Isabella's teenage son, the future Edward III, as the legitimate heir who would restore proper government once his incompetent father was removed from power. This was essential, because a queen leading an invasion alone could be framed as treason, but a queen acting in the name of her son, the rightful heir, could claim moral and legal legitimacy. Every letter they sent, every proclamation they issued emphasized that they were rescuing the young prince from the corrupt influence of the Despensers and from a father who had ceased to govern responsibly. The propaganda they spread emphasized everything Edward had done wrong during his reign: his losses in Scotland where English armies had been defeated, his submission to favorites who looted the country, his inability to command respect or maintain order, his treatment of Isabella herself, and they positioned the invasion not as treason but as a rescue mission to save England from a king who had proven himself completely unfit to rule. For many barons, bishops, and even ordinary knights, this framing rang true. After years of disaster, they were ready to support any movement that promised stability. When Isabella and Mortimer landed in England with their army in 1326, the response from English nobles was overwhelming support for the Queen against her husband, which tells you everything you need to know about how completely Edward had destroyed his own political position through 20 years of putting his personal relationships ahead of his responsibilities as king. Nobles defected almost instantly, entire regions pledged loyalty to the Queen and the young prince, and even Edward's closest supporters began abandoning him, convinced that his fall was inevitable. Edward's regime collapsed so fast once Isabella invaded that it was almost embarrassing, with nobles abandoning him in droves to join the Queen's cause, and within months he was captured and forced to give up the throne in favor of his son. The Despensers who had been so powerful were caught and executed with extreme brutality, Hugh Despenser the younger being hanged, drawn, and quartered with his genitals cut off and burned in front of him as symbolic punishment for the unnatural influence he had wielded over the king through what everyone assumed was a sexual relationship. His father, Hugh Despenser the elder, was also executed, and their fall was celebrated across England as the removal of the men blamed for years of tyranny and humiliation. Edward himself was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle under deliberately harsh conditions, kept in a cell above a pit where rotting animal corpses were dumped so the stench would torture him constantly, and his guards made it clear he was being punished not just for political failure but for the sexual nature of his relationships with his favorites. The cruelty of his confinement was also a political message, a reminder to anyone watching that even a king could face degradation if he allowed private passions to override the welfare of the realm. Contemporary letters describe that Edward's jailers were instructed to break his spirit, ensuring he could never become a rallying point for rebellion. The decision to kill him was made carefully because murdering even a deposed king could create political problems, so the method chosen had to look somewhat like natural death while also serving as final punishment for the sodomy that had scandalized England. Medieval rulers had to worry about martyrdom and legitimacy. A corpse showing obvious signs of murder could divide the nobility or empower factions loyal to the old king. A method that left no visible marks was essential. In September 1327, about 9 months after being deposed, Edward was murdered in his cell in a way that contemporary chroniclers described with remarkable consistency. His killers held him face down, inserted a red-hot iron poker into his anus, and burned his intestines from inside his body. Even though some modern historians debate whether this exact method was used, the fact that multiple medieval sources repeat the same story shows what people of the time believed, that his death was deliberately tailored to fit the moral outrage surrounding his personal life. The pain must have been unimaginable and his screams were reportedly heard throughout the castle, but the method achieved its goal of killing him while leaving minimal external marks that would prove murder to anyone examining the corpse afterward. The choice of murder method was directly connected to the sexual relationships that had defined and destroyed his reign, with the killers making a statement that Edward's transgressions would be punished through the same bodily opening where those transgressions had occurred. And while this sounds barbaric to modern ears, it made perfect sense within medieval Christian morality where sodomy was considered one of the absolute worst sins. Edward II had been king for 20 years, and in that time he had accomplished almost nothing positive while managing to alienate his nobles, humiliate his wife, lose wars in Scotland, and allow favorites to loot the kingdom, all because he could not separate his personal desires from his political responsibilities. His death with a burning rod inside his body was not just murder, it was the symbolic conclusion to a reign that had been defined from beginning to end by the king's inability to control his sexual obsessions, and it served as a brutal reminder that medieval kings who put their lovers before their kingdoms would ultimately be destroyed by the forces they had spent years alienating and enraging.